ahead and dive into our first story, which is about Zelensky. Now, if you are not aware, Zelensky recently had an interview with Time magazine, and apparently he is not too happy about all the attention that is going to Israel and Palestine instead of Ukraine. We have to remember, before the war started, in reference to Israel and Palestine, Ukraine was getting a lot of attention from Joe Biden, from other members of Congress, and of course, the press, the mainstream media. But now, because of the war in Israel and Palestine, the attention on Ukraine is not as big as it used to be. And Zelensky is noticing that. I'm sure you guys have probably noticed it. And he had some things to say. He has some things to say. So in this interview with Time magazine, it says, nobody believes in our victory like I do. Inside, Volodymyr Zelensky's struggle to keep Ukraine in the fight. Let's dive right in. Look, even in this picture, he looks big mad. Big. And look at his face in this picture. How dare they pay attention to someone else? How dare they? So let's go ahead, and I actually want to get started right about here. So one of the things they mentioned is that Zelensky apparently was late to this interview. It says the reason, he later said, was the exhaustion he felt that night, not only from the demands of leadership during the war, but also the persistent need to convince his allies that with their help, Ukraine can win. Nobody believes in our victory like I do. Nobody. So, yeah, nobody. Nobody believes that they can win because we see that you can. We see that you cannot win. Ukraine has been losing, right? And all the weapons and aid packages that have gone to Ukraine has not shifted this conflict in their favor. Obviously, it is very clear that Russia is winning here. He goes on to say, talks of all your power, your energy, or excuse me, takes all your power, your energy. You understand? It takes so much of everything. So let's go on here. It is only getting harder. 20 months into the war, after a fifth of Ukraine's territory remains under Russian occupation, tens and thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed. And Zelensky can feel during his travels that global interest in the war has slackened. Notice here they mention tens and thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed, which is exactly why a lot of us were calling for peace, calling for a ceasefire. There are many casualties in war. It goes on to say, so has the level of international support. The scariest thing is that part of the world got used to the war in Ukraine. Exhaustion with the war rolls along like a wave. You see it in the United States, in Europe. We see that as soon as they start getting a little tired, it becomes like a show to them. I can't watch this rerun for the 10th time. Let's compare this to the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. This is something I think he is correct about here, which is the fact that at the beginning of a war, I do feel like DC politicians and, of course, American citizens as well, we're more focused on it, right? It's the beginning of things. People are heavily paying attention to it. But as time goes on, eventually people just kind of get used to it, which is a bad thing to say, but it happens. It happened with Afghanistan. 20 years, right? 20 years in Afghanistan. Eventually, after a couple years, people just started to tune out and even started to forget that we were over there in the first place. Same thing with the war in Iraq. So it's not uncommon for people to it becomes normalized in a way that you just know, yeah, there's this conflict in Afghanistan. The U.S. is engaged in that. But after a while, I feel like people aren't as focused on it as they were in the very beginning. It also doesn't help that now when you look at this war with Israel, one of the things that you have to note is It's a very different situation, whereas Ukraine and Russia both have weapons that they can use against each other. In the situation with Israel, it's different because Gaza does not have an army. They don't have a military. They're not allowed to have a military. So essentially what you have is this dominant power, which is the state of Israel, which has way more advanced weapons and technology. They control all of the resources. So we see this power taking away resources from Gaza, which they had limited resources to begin with. And you see this power conflicting essentially what we've been referring to as a genocide on the Palestinian people. These are people who are trapped in a fenced in space and they can't get out. So they're kind of just stuck there. So it's different when you compare it to what's happening with Ukraine, because Ukraine has backing from the United States to fight back. Gaza does not. So Zelensky's feeling a little kind of way. He's feeling some kind of way. Public support for aid to Ukraine has been in decline for months in the U.S., and Zelensky's visit did nothing to revive it. Some 41% of Americans want Congress to provide more weapons to Kyiv, down from 65% in June, when Ukraine began a major counteroffensive, according to the Reuters survey taken shortly after Zelensky's departure. That offensive has proceeded at an excruciating pace with enormous losses, making it ever more difficult for Zelensky to convince partners that victory is around the corner. With the outbreak of the war in Israel, even keeping the world's attention on Ukraine has become a major challenge. I want to talk about this decrease in support from Americans in reference to the U.S. sending aid to Ukraine. I think that the Biden administration, I think this is something that caught them by surprise. The fact that more and more Americans do not want forever wars. More and more Americans do not want war at all. The days of the George W. Bush, warmonger tactics, it doesn't work the way that it did back then. And so more Americans are speaking up against war. More Americans are becoming anti-war. So the type of support that more Americans had after September 11 for these types of conflicts, that has decreased over time. And more Americans are starting to say, why are we sending our money and our resources to intervene in these conflicts abroad that have nothing to do with what's happening here in the United States? So more people are speaking out against that. And I don't really think the Biden administration was ready for this. I don't really think they were ready for the numbers of people that came out into the streets globally, protesting against this war in Israel. I don't think they were prepared for that. And I don't think they were ready to respond to the response that they've been getting in reference to both of these conflicts. After his visit to Washington, Time followed the president and his team back to Kyiv, hoping to understand how they would react to the signals they had received, especially the insistent calls for Zelensky to fight corruption inside his own government and the fading enthusiasm for a war with no end in sight. On my first day in Kyiv, I asked one member of his circle how the president was feeling. The response came without seconds hesitation: angry. The usual spark of his optimism, his sense of humor, his tendency to liven up a meeting in the war room with a bit of banter or a bawdy joke, none of that has survived into the second year of an all-out war. Now he walks in, gets the updates, gives the orders, and walks out. Now, this is coming from a longtime member of his team. Another tells me that most of all, Zelensky feels betrayed by his Western allies. They have left him without the means to win the war, only the means to survive it. Now, I just want to add in here a little bit of update. it was just announced that the U.S. government is sending another over $400 million weapons package to Ukraine. So the United States government has not forgotten about Zelensky. They have not forgotten about Ukraine. It just appears to me that Zelensky is not happy that he's no longer in the spotlight anymore, that a more pressing conflict has now taken that spotlight away from him. But the U.S. government is still sending Ukraine aid. So what's it really about? Let's go on. But his convictions haven't changed. Despite the recent setbacks on the battlefield, he does not intend to give up fighting or to sue for any kind of peace. On the contrary, his belief in Ukraine's ultimate victory over Russia has hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors. It is unmovable, verging on the Messianic. He deludes himself, one of his closest aides tells me in frustration. We're out of options. We're not winning, but try telling him that. And this is something that we've been saying all along, right? Like, it's obvious that they're not. Mainstream media tried to convince the American people that they were winning. They were not winning. And now we hear more confirmation about this from people closest to him. And he's the only one walking around saying that we can beat this, we can win this, when it is very clear that that is not the case. How many more packages does the U.S. government have to send to Ukraine for Zelensky to finally realize that he has no chance here? How many? He wants to continue fighting, meaning he's going to continue to bleed the U.S. government dry. How long is this going to go on? How long? Zelensky's stubbornness, some of his aides say, has hurt their team's efforts to come up with a new strategy, a new message. As they have debated the future of the war, one issue has remained taboo: the possibility of negotiating a peace deal with the Russians. Judging by recent surveys, most Ukrainians would reject such a move, especially if it entailed the loss of any occupied territory. Zelensky remains dead set against even a temporary truce. For us, it would mean leaving this wound open for future generations. Leaving the wound open for future generations. I would imagine having a crumbling economy, which is happening, what's happening to Ukraine right now. And when this is all said and done, I'll be surprised if they even have an economy left. I would say that that would actually be an open wound for future generations. Maybe it will calm some people down inside our country and outside, at least those who want to wrap up things to wrap up at any price. But for me, that's a problem, because we are left with this explosive force. We only delay its detonation. For now, he is intent on winning the war on Ukrainian terms, and he is shifting tactics to achieve that, aware that the flow of Western arms could dry up over time. The Ukrainians have ramped up production of drones and missiles, which they have used to attack Russian supply routes, command centers, and ammunition depots far behind enemy lines. The Russians have responded with more bombing raids against civilians, more missile strikes against the infrastructure that Ukraine will need to heat homes and keep the lights on through the winter. Zelensky describes it as a war of wills, and he fears that if the Russians are not stopped in Ukraine, the fighting will spread beyond its borders. Let me just chime in here for a second. This is the same type of fear mongering that some politicians are using right now in reference to Hamas. I don't know if you guys have seen this on Twitter, but some politicians are now saying that Hamas could come to the United States. Really? They can't leave Gaza, you fool. Let me get this straight. They can't leave Gaza. They can't get into Egypt, but they're going to come to the United States. This is the fear mongering, guys. This is what I was telling you. This is what they're doing. Zelensky goes on to say, I have long lived with this fear, he says. A third world war could start in Ukraine, continue in Israel, and move on from there to Asia, and then explode somewhere else. And if that were to happen, whose fault would that be? Because, see, calling for a ceasefire, calling for peace, calling for some type of negotiation would prevent all of that, all of it. But it is very clear that Zelensky wants this to continue. This is all on NATO. NATO has a lot to do with this here. They wanted this war, and that's why we're here now. That was his message in Washington. Help Ukraine stop the war before it spreads and before it's too late. He worries his audience has stopped paying attention. You know, I wouldn't say that people have stopped paying attention, but I will say that people know that you can't win. People know this. And I believe Zelensky knows this as well. I believe he knows this as well. They're just bleeding the U.S. dry. Let's go on to this piece here. At the end of last year, during his previous visit to Washington, Zelensky received a hero's welcome. The White House sent a U.S. Air Force jet to pick him up in eastern Poland a few days before Christmas. And with an escort from a NATO spy plane and an F-15 Eagle fighter, delivered him to Joint Base Andrews outside the U.S. Capitol. That evening, Zelensky appeared before a joint session of Congress to declare that Ukraine had defeated Russia in the battle for minds of the world. I told you guys then that wasn't true. Watching his speech from the balcony, I counted 13 standing ovations before I stopped keeping track. One senator told me he could not remember a time in 3 decades on Capitol Hill when a foreign leader received such an admiring reception. A few right-wing Republicans refused to stand or applaud for Zelensky, but the votes to support him were bipartisan and overwhelming throughout last year. This time around, the atmosphere has changed. Assistance to Ukraine had become a sticking point in the debate over the federal budget. One of Zelensky's foreign policy advisors urged him to call off the trip in September, warning that the atmosphere was too fraught. Congressional leaders declined to let Zelensky deliver a public address on Capitol Hill. His aides tried to arrange an in-person appearance for him, get this, guys, on Fox News and an interview with Oprah Winfrey. Neither one came through. Now, I just want to chime in here and say this. Honey, if Oprah told you no, that's bad news. That is bad news. We all know that Oprah Winfrey likes to take on these complex situations, and she loves to interview people that are controversial. We all know this. So if Oprah told you no, what does that tell you, Zelensky? What does that tell you? You got snubbed by Oprah. She don't even want to talk to you. And then this part here, it goes on to say, instead of the morning of September 21st, Zelensky met in private with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy before making his way to the old Senate chamber, where lawmakers grilled him behind closed doors. Most of Zelensky's usual critics stayed silent in the session. Senator Ted Cruz strolled in more than 20 minutes late. The Democrats, for their part, wanted to understand where the war was headed and how badly Ukraine needed U.S. support. They asked me straight up, if we don't give you the aid, what happens? Zelensky recalls. What happens is we will lose. Interesting. Interesting. So, yeah, I did notice that when he was here recently, that they didn't seem as receptive to him this time around. It goes on to say Zelensky's performance left a deep impression on some of the lawmakers present. Angus King, an independent senator from Maine, recalled the Ukrainian leader telling his audience, "You're giving money. We are giving our lives." But it was not enough. 10 days later, Congress passed a bill to temporarily avert a government shutdown. It included no assistance to Ukraine. But I just told you, they've already approved a $400 million aid package to Ukraine as of today. But it seems like to me, Zelensky feels that Israel and Gaza may be getting a little too much attention, and he feels like the U.S. government may forget about him and he may be neglected. Now, I'll say to this, I think some of this has to deal with a little bit of vanity as well, too, right? I think Zelensky got used to the public spotlight. Him and his wife were on the cover of Vogue magazine. Like, this didn't make no sense to me. He was nominated, or actually not nominated. He won. What, Time Magazine's Person of the Year. So I think he was used to getting a lot of that attention. And for Oprah Winfrey to reject him, I think he just feels some kind of way, right? But to me, I feel like he just wants that attention. Remember, this guy used to be a comedian. Now, Nico House had something to say about this. I thought this was really interesting, the way that he described Zelensky's state of mind at this point in time, when you know that you just cannot win, but you're continuing to tell people that you can. I honestly just think that Zelensky has gotten used to having that attention and that spotlight. He's becoming somewhat of a ham, he's loving this. And now that people are starting to tell him no, and even Fox News told him no, that is a big sign. But listen to what Nico had to say. I thought this was funny.
According to this article in Time Magazine, Zelensky says he feels betrayed by his Western allies. He says they've left him with no means to win the war, only a means to survive it. As if they ever actually had a chance to win that war anyway. But whatever. At a time where Bibi Netanyahu is getting anything and everything he wants from the West to support his genocide in Gaza, it's looking like Ukraine and Zelensky are trying to cope with being replaced. Hell, during his recent visit to the States, they tried to get him on Fox News, and they even tried to get him on Oprah. Both declined to entertain Zelensky. Now you know it's bad whenever Oprah is declining to entertain your sob story, because we know there is nothing more that Oprah loves than a sob story that can make her some money. But it looks like the West and the mainstream in general have collectively decided that they can no longer profit off pushing Zelensky's agenda in Ukraine. Now, you would think that this would mean that maybe Zelensky is more than willing to start engaging in peace talks with Russia, but according to his advisors, it's the opposite. They say his resolve has hardened to the point where they feel he is completely delusional. His aide even said in frustration, "We're out of options. We're not winning." But try telling him that. Zelensky is learning a very difficult lesson that many of us tried to warn him about from the beginning of this escalation in Ukraine. And that lesson is, the only thing potentially more dangerous than being an enemy of the United States is being an ally of the United States. Because when it is most convenient for them, they will toss you out like yesterday's leftovers.
Dangerous being an ally of the United States. This is so true. Once it gets to the point where there's nothing in it for the United States government, they will forget about you. Well said, Nico. Well said. And I'm going to go to some of the comments here. Thank you for the super chat, P. Smith. Miss Zelensky spent $1 million at Cartier. JB says, gosh, he's such a big baby. Yes, he is. And thank you for the super chat, Roger. Kick rocks Zelensky. And Kristen says, Nico, always on point. There you go. There you go. Yeah. One of the things I was surprised that Time article actually pointed out the corruption that is happening in Ukraine, because that's something that some of us in independent media have been touching on that a little bit, but I was actually surprised for Time Magazine to actually point that out, because it is a problem. And there have been questions about where's all the money going, where are all these, aid packages going that we're sending to Ukraine. There have been claims allegedly that it's not being used in the places that it's supposed to be used. So surprised they said that, but they did.